The steady hum of the moving van's engine faded as it retreated down the tree-lined street. I stood outside number 16, taking a moment to admire my new sanctuary. The white paint gleamed in the sun, the porch was inviting, and the lawn, though in need of a trim, was a verdant green. After the chaos of the past year, this place promised a clean slate, a haven from the incessant whispers of my past. The cul-de-sac was a picture of suburbia, kids playing catch in the driveways, neighboring adults exchanging the latest gossip, and gardens vying for the title of Best Bloom. Every home seemed to exude warmth and an open-door policy. Every home except for one, number 15. It stood there, sandwiched between well-kept properties, a stark contrast with its overgrown yard and shadowed windows. Its lifelessness was palpable, making it stick out like a sore thumb. And as days transitioned to nights, the peculiarities of number 15 began to unveil themselves. One evening, after returning from a walk, I noticed Mr. Collins, the lone resident of the mysterious house, dragging his trash can to the curb. The sound was jarringly loud, suggesting its heavy contents. What caught my attention wasn't the act itself, but the nature of the bags he discarded. Thick, heavy-duty plastic that looked like they carried more than just everyday trash. It might have seemed insignificant to anyone else, but it tickled the edge of my memory, making my palms sweat. Then came the late-night sounds. One time, as I sat reading in my study, which shared a wall with Mr. Collins's garage, the unmistakable hum of power tools seeped through. It was nearly midnight. Odd time for a DIY project, I thought, curiosity piquing. The final straw came on a weekend afternoon. I was lounging in my backyard when the wind carried over an intense smell of bleach. Peeking over the fence, I observed Mr. Collins scrubbing his garage floor with fervor, his eyes darting around as if fearing a watcher, which, I suppose, he had in me. Curiosity led me to the local library. If there was something to know about Mr. Collins, or if there were any stories related to number 15, the archives would have them. Hours of poring over old newspapers gave me more than I bargained for. A series of articles detailed unsolved disappearances of young women over the past 2 years. Their last known locations, not too far from our quaint neighborhood. Chillingly, the police sketches, while vague, bore a haunting resemblance to Mr. Collins. The discovery sent me reeling. Was I living next door to a potential killer? The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me, given my own concealed past. It felt like the universe's cruel joke. I decided, that evening, that I would find a way to confirm my suspicions about Mr. Collins. Whether it was to expose a fellow monster or to put my restless mind at ease, I wasn't sure. But I knew that the truth about number 15 was just waiting to be unearthed. The following days felt like a journey down a rabbit hole. Each discovery about Mr. Collins only added layers to the enigma of number 15. As I discreetly watched him, the signs began to piece together. The nervous glances, the late-night activities, the meticulous cleaning. Every observation seemed to validate the sinister picture painted by those newspaper clippings. One evening, lost in thought, I was jolted back to reality by a flood of memories. It began as a whisper, growing louder, turning into a cacophony of familiar voices, all too recent to be forgotten. I found myself back in that dimly lit room, the cold, sterile smell surrounding me. A symphony of muffled sobs and pleads played in my mind. The weight of the garrote in my hand, the rush, the power, it was intoxicating. The juxtaposition of my past with Mr. Collins's alleged deeds felt eerily symmetrical. It was a game of shadows, where the hunter could easily become the hunted. And while I had perfected my game, leaving no trace, it seemed Mr. Collins, if the stories were true, was growing reckless. I had taken great pains to escape my old life. After the last close call in my previous town, where an investigative journalist had gotten too close for comfort, I knew it was time to disappear. The last thing I needed was another predator in my territory, especially one as seemingly careless as Mr. Collins. But the newspaper's stories and police sketches weren't enough. Before I acted, I needed concrete proof. An idea began to form. I'd take a closer look at Mr. Collins's home during one of his nightly escapades. I knew the risks involved. Breaking into a potential killer's den was dangerous, but the pull was irresistible. A few nights later, the opportunity presented itself. Mr. Collins, carrying a small bag, left his house and headed in the direction of the nearby woods. I waited for a few moments, ensuring he was far enough away, and then made my move. Approaching his house was like stepping into another world. The overgrown vegetation rustled with the whispers of secrets, and the house itself seemed to groan under the weight of its mysteries. Finding a window ajar, I carefully slipped inside. The home was a time capsule. Old furniture draped with sheets, layers of dust on every surface, and fading photographs of a younger Mr. Collins with a woman, perhaps a spouse or a sibling. But it was the basement that called out to me, a magnetic pull drawing me downwards. What I found there was a macabre tableau that seemed all too familiar. Chains, tools, and what looked like bloodstains, though old and faded. It felt like stepping into a mirror image of my own secret chamber. The realization hit hard. Mr. Collins wasn't just a suspect, he was a reflection. Exiting as silently as I had entered, the weight of my discovery pressed down on me. Two monsters, living side by side. The game had just gotten more complicated. But this time, I wasn't just playing for thrills. I was playing for survival. Night after night, I found myself torn between my own dark urges and the unfolding drama next door. Each time, I heard a muffled cry, or the familiar hum of a power tool from number 15. Memories of my own victims echoed in response. The parallelism was eerie, and a haunting question lingered. Could two predators coexist without turning on each other? It was on one of these nights, when the moon cast long shadows over the cul-de-sac, that I felt particularly restless. The weight of the secrets I harbored in my basement, combined with the macabre discoveries at Mr. Collins's residence, was suffocating. The silence of the night was disrupted when a piercing scream emanated from number 15. This time, it was different. The desperation, the sheer terror was palpable. Frozen in place, my instincts wrestled with my conscience. Part of me wanted to become the silent witness, to let events unfold without interference, to watch another predator at work. But another part of me, perhaps the last thread of humanity, urged me to intervene. The cries that I heard weren't just any victim. They mirrored the pleas of the many souls I'd silenced. I found myself moving, almost in a trance, towards Mr. Collins's home. Each step was a dance between the hunter and the savior within me. Approaching the house, the gravity of the situation became evident. The front door was slightly ajar, allowing fragmented sounds of a struggle to filter through. Stealthily, I made my way in. The familiar, chilling atmosphere of number 15 greeted me once again. Following the noise, I descended into the basement. Hiding in the shadows, I bore witness to a scene that could have been lifted from my own dark chapters. A young woman, bound and terrified, while Mr. Collins, his back to me, seemed to prepare for the next phase of his ritual. An internal debate raged. Do I step in and save the girl, thereby exposing my own secrets? Or do I remain the silent observer, a spectator to another's sins? However, as the minutes ticked by, the gravity of the situation forced a decision. Maybe it was a twisted desire to assert dominance over another predator, or perhaps a fragment of morality tugging at my conscience. But I knew I had to intervene. Choosing the element of surprise, I lunged at Mr. Collins. Caught off guard, he staggered, and the two of us grappled, our combined shadows dancing grotesquely on the walls. But the advantage of surprise was on my side. Before long, Mr. Collins was incapacitated. The young woman, eyes wide with terror, stared first at her assailant, then at her unlikely savior. The weight of the moment, the realization of what I had done, began to sink in. The lines were blurring rapidly. In that basement, amidst the darkness, it was getting increasingly hard to tell who was the real monster. With Mr. Collins restrained, I quickly turned my attention to the terrified woman. Her eyes, glossy with tears, darted between her captor and me. The realization dawned on me that while I had intervened in this particular act, my hands were far from clean. I could see the question in her gaze. Was I here to save her, or merely replace one tormentor with another? Unbinding her, I tried to convey reassurance through my eyes. "You need to leave. Now," I whispered. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the sincerity of my words against the potential danger of them. But the urgency in my voice seemed to propel her into action. Within moments, she was gone, disappearing into the night. I turned back to Mr. Collins, whose once menacing presence now seemed diminished. Bound and helpless, he looked every bit the frail old man from next door. But his eyes, those still burned with an intensity, a mix of hatred and, surprisingly, understanding. For a few moments, the basement was a silent stage for our shared understanding, a wordless confrontation between two predators. Then, Mr. Collins broke the silence, his voice raspy. "You think you're any different from me? We're two sides of the same coin," while his words held a grain of truth. I wasn't ready to accept our equivalence just yet. "Maybe," I responded coldly. "But right now, you're the one tied up." We continued our dance of words, circling around our shared dark desires, trying to decipher the other. It was a game of one-upmanship, each trying to unravel the other's psyche while guarding our own. The night deepened, and with it, the tension. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind seemed magnified in the confines of the basement. As dawn approached, a decision loomed. I couldn't keep Mr. Collins restrained forever. Neither could I let him go, not with the secrets he now held. It was then that a knock echoed through the house. Panic surged. Who could it be? The police? A concerned neighbor? Or perhaps the woman returning with help? The knock sounded again, more insistent. I needed to act. Gathering my wits, I left Mr. Collins in the basement, ensuring he was securely bound. As I approached the door, the silhouette of a familiar face greeted me through the frosted glass. Upon opening, Mr. Collins's words rang true. Standing there, holding a casserole dish with an all-too-familiar wry smile was none other than him. Except it wasn't. It was like looking into a twisted mirror. "Thought you'd like this," he began, that sinister grin never leaving his face. "An old family recipe." Confusion reigned. How was this possible? Was the man in the basement an imposter, or was this a cruel trick of the mind? The man outside continued, "Good fences make good neighbors, right?" The situation spiraled. Two Mr. Collinses, one at my door and one in my basement. The lines of reality were blurring, and the dangerous game had just taken an unexpected turn. Staring at the doppelganger at my doorstep, my mind raced to make sense of the impossible situation. The casserole dish, a symbol of the twisted camaraderie between Mr. Collins and me, felt like a mocking gesture in the hands of this second Mr. Collins. "Is everything all right?" the man at the door pressed, his voice dripping with feigned concern. The undercurrent of malevolence was unmistakable. I had to think quickly. With one Mr. Collins bound in my basement and another at my doorstep, I was trapped in a nightmarish scenario. Taking a deep breath, I made a split-second decision. "Thank you for the dish, Mr. Collins," I replied, forcing a smile. "I'll enjoy it later." I quickly shut the door, locking it behind me. The urgency of the situation demanded action. Racing downstairs, I was met with an empty basement. The restraints lay discarded, and there was no sign of the captive Mr. Collins. A chill ran down my spine. The realization hit hard. There was only one Mr. Collins. Somehow, he had managed to escape his bonds and turn the tables on me. The game had shifted, and now I was the one being hunted. Every creak of the house felt like a threat. The once familiar surroundings of number 16 became a maze of shadows. In the echoing silence, I could almost hear Mr. Collins's taunting whispers, reminding me of our shared darkness and the inescapable bond it had forged. I armed myself, preparing for the final confrontation. The silent strangler was not one to be cornered easily. The hours dragged, turning the night into a prolonged game of cat and mouse. Then, just as the first light of dawn began to filter in, a noise from the kitchen grabbed my attention. Steeling myself, I ventured towards the sound, only to find the casserole dish shattered on the floor, its contents spilled. A note lay beside it. Good fences make good neighbors, but some games are better left unplayed. It was clear that Mr. Collins had retreated, but his message was a chilling reminder of the dangerous dance we had shared. Days turned into weeks. The quiet of Juniper Lane resumed its rhythm, but the memories of that night lingered. I found myself constantly watching number 15, waiting for some sign of Mr. Collins, but it remained as enigmatic as ever. Eventually, moving trucks appeared, signaling new occupants for number 15. As I watched the young family settle in, a heavy realization weighed on me. In the game of shadows, the lines between predator and prey, hunter and hunted, had been irrevocably blurred. The question that haunted me wasn't about who had won or lost, but rather, in the dance of darkness, had we become indistinguishable from each other?